are delighted to present Dr. Tinky Weisblat this evening, who has come all the way from Western Massachusetts and found her way to Southbridge, which is even more.
Yes, I was happy to find it.
Yes, indeed. So welcome, Tinky, to Southbridge. I'm hoping that you're going to have a wonderful evening learning about all these wonderful concoctions that Tinky is capable of making and has shared her recipes with us. And we will have copies of the recipes in our collection. So if you were inspired, having seen this program this evening, to come to the library and see if you too can make the gorgeous and delicious tea that we've just had. It's rhubarb tea.
And there's cake.
And there's rhubarb cake as well. As you know, Tinky is an author, and some of her books are here, and I shall turn them to face out, actually. And Love, Laughter and Rhubarb is the title, and what could be more compelling?
Yes.
So we are thrilled that you're here.
Thank you.
I would like if you maybe would give some little biographical piece, you know, talking about your education and where how you got to this point in your life. So, a warm Southbridge welcome.
Well, thank you.
Tinky Weisblat.
Would you like some tea?
Thank you.
Come sit with us. So I did not at all intend to be a food writer. Not that there's anything wrong with being a food writer. And as will tell you in a minute, I really like being a food writer. But it was not something I thought about at all. And I got a master's degree in journalism, and then I got a PhD in American Studies. So I studied mostly American popular culture, and came back to Massachusetts and worked as a freelance writer. And I think I told Erin this story. Anyway, one day there I was at the local general store, and I ran into another writer, and she said, "Do you ever write about food? Because I have a friend who just became the food editor at the Boston Globe." So if you're a writer, you always say that you write about things, because there are not that many jobs. So I said, of course I write about food. In fact, I was just thinking that maybe I should write about rhubarb, because this was May and it was just coming up. So that kind of got me started. And once I started writing about food, I found that it gave me a wonderful way to use all my many, many educations, because you can write about food and pretty much write about anything. So, for example, I studied film a lot, and I could never get a job writing about film. But then if I decided to write a food piece for the Academy Awards, I could just mention foods that were in the films, and I could talk about the films at great length, as long as I had recipes. Yeah. So the other thing that I really found very rewarding about it was that, you know, we are kind of in a divided country, and people get very stressed out about a lot of things in life. And at one time I thought, well, why am I, you know, there's all this stuff going on in the world, there are wars, there's political divides, why the heck am I writing about food? And then I realized that actually it's kind of important to write about food, because food brings people together, and food nurtures us both physically and spiritually. So I really feel that I'm very lucky to write about something that makes people so happy. My grandfather used to say that there was nothing he could think of, and he meant nothing, not even sex, that he could do 3 times a day, every day of his life, and still enjoy the next day, except for eating. And I think that's true. Food makes us happy, and writing about food makes me happy. So it's been a really neat thing to do. And I started out just writing articles, and then I eventually moved into books. So the first one was the Pudding Hollow Cookbook, which you can see there with the cute folk art illustrations on the cover. That was the idea of the artist. We had Hawley, my little tiny town, had its bicentennial, and we had a pageant reenacting, among other things, a legendary pudding contest in town in the 1780s. And Judy, the artist, who, as you can see, is kind of a Grandma Moses-esque person, said, I think we should do a cookbook, and you should write about it, do the writing and write the recipes, and I should do the art, and we'll call it the Pudding Hollow Cookbook, because the woman who won the pudding contest in 1780, Mrs. Baker, was thereafter known as Pudding Head. And the town in which she lived was, not the town, but the part of our town in which she lived, which is also where I live, was thereafter called Pudding Hollow. So I said, well, sure, let's do that, because I had never written a cookbook. And I thought, how hard could it be? Well, it turns out that writing a cookbook is a little bit like having a baby. If you knew what you were doing when you started the whole process, you might not actually do it, because it gets a little difficult at times and awkward. But then in the end, you're very happy about it. So that was kind of the way writing my first cookbook was. And it was really a labor of love. And Judy died, unfortunately, the artist, when we were just starting it. So I had to kind of reshape it. So what I did was I wrote to everyone I knew who had any of her art, and I wrote to her daughter who knew more people. And I said, may I borrow your art, please? And we'll take pictures of it. And no, I'm not going to pay you, but you will be immortalized. So we got a lot of wonderful art, and it's a nice sort of memorial to her. And I felt when I was putting it together as though, because I'd go, what goes with this piece of art? I felt as though she was kind of sitting over my shoulder and watching me and guiding me. So that was a really fun process. My second book, it was not actually, didn't start out having any recipes. So that's called Pulling Taffy, and it was about taking care of my mother, who died in 2011 and had Alzheimer's disease. And I started writing a journal the last year of her life, although I had no idea it was going to be the last year of her life, because who knows when somebody's going to die. But I started writing it on January 1st, and she bizarrely died in December. Not my doing, I swear. But it made a full year. And it gave me a lot of solace, and I put a lot of it online as a blog, and it seemed to help other people who are going through that sort of thing, because it's a very difficult, as some of you may know, disease. But writing about it kind of gave me perspective, and it also helped me find anything funny that had happened during the day. And I think that when you're in any situation that involves adversity, and goodness knows dealing with Alzheimer's disease involves adversity, the best thing you can do is keep your sense of humor. So it helped me, and it's helped other people. And then when I was turning it into a book in the end, I thought, well, maybe I'll just put in a recipe, just because we cooked a lot together. And then I put in another recipe. And anyway, that ended up having a recipe for every chapter of the book, because cooking was something that that my mother and I did together. And it was, I think, very important, not just throughout her life, because she was a great cook, and that's where I learned to cook, obviously. But in the last year of her life, I think one of the problems with people who have infirmities of one sort or another is that we tend to treat them as completely helpless. And we live in a culture that truly values being useful. So if I was cooking, she really, really wanted to help. And at first I would say, that's okay, you can just talk to me. And then I realized it's important for her to help. So even though if she cut something, I usually had to cut it again. It was not a perfect process, but it made her happy. It helped make dinner or whatever, and it brought us together. So meanwhile, I'm working on a longer project that I'll tell you about in a minute, but about a year and a half ago, I thought, I need another cookbook pretty quickly, so what can I do? And of course, my thoughts, I don't know whether your thoughts ever turn to rhubarb, possibly not, but my thoughts frequently turn to rhubarb because it's one of my favorite foods in the world. And so I thought I could just throw together a quick rhubarb cookbook. Well, of course, it's like everything else. Was it quick? No. Because I thought I had all these recipes, and I did, but then I needed more recipes, and then I had to figure out what the illustrations would be, because I no longer had this wonderful artist. But it didn't take too long to put together. So that took about 2 years in the end, or a year and a half, really. So let me tell you a little bit about rhubarb and my relationship with rhubarb, which has been slightly conflicted over the years, because when I was a very small child, my grandmother, whose kitchen table I have right now, would set me down at that very kitchen table. It was a big oval oak table at her home in Vermont, and she would come right in with a dish of stewed rhubarb and say, "Here you go, it's so good for you," which is not what you tell children. It's not what you told me as a child anyway. Telling me that it was good for me was not really what I wanted to hear. So I was like, no, I don't like it. It's tart, and it's weird in consistency, and I don't think I want to eat it. And it's old-fashioned, and I was a very new child. I liked modern things. So that was that for a while, although she kept trying, and my mother kept trying, because my mother also just adored rhubarb. But eventually they figured out that they were not going to convince me that stewed rhubarb was the sine qua non of eating. So moving on, about 15 or 20 years ago, I was out in the yard, and there was the rhubarb. And just growing there, and I love free things. I really do. I mean, the whole concept of free food to me is golden. So I thought, I could just pick a few stalks and see what I want to do with them. And it turned out that as an adult, I actually really love rhubarb. It has become a passion for me. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is just sort of unloading the whole baggage with the mother and grandmother. By that time, my grandmother had died. My mother was older. And so I didn't feel that whole, you know how relationships you can have with your mothers or grandmothers. It's like, no, I don't want to do what you want me to do. I want to do what I want to do. I am my own person. By this time, I thought, well, I could do what they want occasionally, and it won't kill me. I was pretty strong in my own personality by then. And then when I discovered that I liked it, and I was already a food writer at this point, I thought, what can I do with this? And it turns out there's a lot that you can do with rhubarb. It goes with not just strawberries, which is the thing that most of us think of when we think of rhubarb, but it goes with a lot of different flavors. For example, so in the book I have a coconut rhubarb pie, which I just love. It really works well with the coconut. I have a lamb and rhubarb stew that is possibly my favorite recipe is always different depending on what I most recently ate, but it's got to be one of my favorites because it's cooked for a really long time, and you can still, so it sort of mutes both the flavors, but you can still taste them both, and they complement each other really well. Neither of them overwhelms the other. To me, sometimes when you have strawberry and rhubarb, the strawberry kind of overwhelms the rhubarb, which is, of course, why so many people like it, because there are still people out there who think they don't like rhubarb, but I think they're just waiting to be persuaded that they do like rhubarb. I'm convinced that eventually, as I go through the world talking about rhubarb, that everyone will love rhubarb as soon as I do that. So that's one reason. Another reason that I think it's so wonderful is that it's actually kind of good for you. The history of rhubarb was that rhubarb was originally not eaten. It was known as a drug, a stomach medicine, and it was originally grown in China. And it was actually a slightly different version of rhubarb. I was recently at Hancock Shaker Village, and in their medicinal herb garden they have a Chinese rhubarb plant. And it still has beautiful red stalks, but the leaves are quite different from our conventional rhubarb. I was very excited to see it, and I asked them if I could take home a stalk and play with it, and they said, probably not, because it'll make you sick. First they said, well, you can try, and then they looked it up and said, no. So what the Chinese did originally was they would grind up the root, they would dry it and grind it up, and the powder was used for a variety of stomach medicines, some of which seem to contradict each other. For example, it was used both for diarrhea and constipation, and I'm not sure how that worked. I think that one of its major virtues as a medicine was that, unlike many medieval medicines, it never killed anybody who ate it, unless you ate the leaves, but they were all eating the ground roots. So Europeans really wanted to grow rhubarb. for centuries, and they could never figure it out. And they would try importing it from China, but I don't know how, do any of you have rhubarb in your yard?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you guys probably know that if you try to grow it from seed, it doesn't work very well. It's like apples. You know, the best way to duplicate an apple tree is to graft the branches or whatever they call it. I'm not an agriculturalist. But same thing with rhubarb. The best way to duplicate rhubarb is to get somebody to dig up and separate their rhubarb and give you some. If you grow it from seed, it's very unreliable. But in those days, because there was no quick way from China to Europe, let alone the United States, they could not import rhubarb. They finally found this other plant that grew in Europe that wasn't quite as good medicinally, although it's not bad for you. There are all sorts of studies that say that it kind of staves off cancer and it keeps you regular and it does all sorts of stuff for you, but it's not quite the same as the Chinese rhubarb. But the Europeans decided, well, if they couldn't make it into the world's best medicine, maybe they would try eating it. And when they decided this is just about the time that sugar became widely available and became affordable. So it does make a difference because most rhubarb recipes, not all, I have several that don't have sugar, but most rhubarb recipes require sugar because it is so tart. So once the sugar became available, there was like a rhubarb craze. And perhaps most famously, there's an area in Yorkshire, England, called the Rhubarb Triangle, which is known so much for its rhubarb that Yorkshire Rhubarb is like a trademark name, like, you know how champagne actually has to be from Champagne, or, you know, Roquefort cheese has to be from Roquefort, or whatever. Yorkshire Rhubarb, if it's called Yorkshire Rhubarb, it has to be grown in this small area of Yorkshire. And what they do, which is quite fascinating, and I would love to see it sometime, is they grow this very tender, very red rhubarb because it's called forcing. They plant the plants, and then they dig them up in the fall, and they put them in these dark, very hotly heated sheds. So there's no light, there's an enormous amount of heat. And the rhubarb suddenly goes bananas. And I don't know whether this is true. You know the internet. So I have heard on the internet people say this is a recording of the rhubarb going hop, 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 because it's growing so fast that it's actually making noise as it expands. And then they don't dig it up, they harvest it in like February. And they used to have a train that went from Yorkshire to Covent Garden, the big market in England, and that was called the Rhubarb Express. So it's not quite as popular as it used to be, but they still love it in Yorkshire, and they have a rhubarb festival every February and March that if I do well enough with selling copies of this book, I'm going to go to it. So anyway, where was I? So it became popular in Europe, came to the United States. Some people say with Benjamin Franklin, probably not, but we like to give him credit for a lot of things. And of course, it's mostly grown in northern climes. So it's one of those things that people like Thomas Jefferson would experiment with and then realize that they really couldn't grow because it has to be reasonably cool. But we're lucky enough to be able to have it. And it was still quite popular. I guess it reached its heyday in the early part of the 20th century. And then in World War II, a lot of the people who were working on the larger farms went into the war. And it never quite regained industrial production. But to me, that makes it special, that it's kind of a secret that some of us know, and that it's really pretty much only available in season, which there aren't a lot of other things like that anymore. If you go to your grocery store, they may not be the best tomatoes in the world, but you can get tomatoes in December, or you can get strawberries in February. But rhubarb is pretty much there when it's there. So to me, that makes me really treasure it and love it. And you know, I do occasionally, I have been known to import it frozen, but it's really contrary to my theory of free food, because when you buy it frozen from a farm in the Midwest, it costs more to ship than it does to buy. Anyway, another reason I love rhubarb is that it reminds me of places and people whom I've been fond of. So this year, I asked the selectmen of my tiny town to make rhubarb the official food. I didn't want to say fruit because there's this whole thing where it's not really a fruit, it's a vegetable. I just said food. Food. The official food of Hawley. And even though they like me, they said, "You're just trying to sell books, right?" And I said, "Not entirely. Although, yes, I would like to sell books." But to me, rhubarb is like a lot of our smaller New England towns. It's kind of gritty. It's kind of not always beautiful, but it's really strong. It's really colorful. It's actually quite adaptable. And so it's got its own personality, but it also works well with other flavors. So it works with places like that for me. And it also works with people. So among the people, it makes me think of, and I think I wrote about this actually in Pudding Hollow, not in the rhubarb book, but I'll tell you about my grandmother. So she and her sisters were orphaned when she was 9. Their parents both died of tuberculosis. And they were in New York City, and they were put in an orphanage of some kind. And there was a very strange, curmudgeonly man in Vermont named Mr. Capron. She never called him anything but Mr. Capron, who decided that he had quite a bit of money, which turned out to be useful to my grandmother like 30 years later, but it wasn't very useful to her then. He decided he really disliked all of his relatives. And so in order not to leave any of his money to his relatives, he decided he would adopt a child. So he had a friend, this is a colleague of his in Rutland, Vermont, was going to New York on business. And he said, "I know there are a lot of orphanages down there. Just go get me an orphan, bring it back, and that'll be my child, and this child will inherit my money." So the friend went to the orphanage, and he saw this really quite adorable little girl with a beautiful singing voice. My grandmother had a gorgeous voice. And he thought, well, she's kind of cute. Maybe she'll do. So he said, "I'll take that one." And this was long before social services, so if you said, "I'd like that orphan," they just kind of said, "Okay, here she is." It's really a little scary. Much worse things could have happened to my grandmother than happened to my grandmother. But, so she went back on the train to Rutland, Vermont with this gentleman and was given to the farmer, Mr. Capron, who was as miserly as the day was long. So he pretty much neglected her. He did send her to school for a while, but he never bought her new clothes. She's a growing girl. No new shoes, no new dresses, no warm winter stuff as she's going, the whole walking to school in the snow. So luckily her older sister in New York, who was in touch with her, would send her things, but she was not very well cared for. And then when she got to 8th grade, he said, "Well, now it's time for you to just work on the farm, and you don't need to go to school." And she was a very smart little girl. So fortunately for her, the man who had actually selected her in the orphanage, he and his wife had, oh my gosh, maybe 9 children, all of whom died of juvenile diabetes. And it was just a weird genetic fluke because they were quite healthy, but something somewhere didn't work. And it was very tragic for them, and I've seen photo albums because this is some of which have the corpses, because that's what they did in the 1800s. They take a picture of the baby before they put it in the ground so that you could have a memory. Anyway, they were they were a very devoted couple, but they were very sad that they had never had any children. So, and they thought she was a very nice little girl, young girl by this time. So they said to Mr. Capron, "Well, if you want her to go to work, why doesn't she come to us? She can be our hired girl." Actually, we had a hired girl, so she was never their hired girl. She was their daughter, but this was the deal. "And we'll pay you a little salary for her, and we'll let her go to school." So as long as he didn't have to pay and was getting a little income, he was happy. So that worked out. They sent her to school. They sent her to college. They eventually, when he died, they were very good about it. They waited till he was dead. Then they adopted her when she was, I think she'd already been married several years by the time they adopted her, but they wanted her to know that she really was their daughter. And so I always think of her as sort of being Rhubarb-esque in the sense that she went through those long, cold winters kind of underground, as it were, kind of not quite existing, and then finally flourished in the spring when she was adopted by these lovely people. Her sister, to me, and I do write about the sister in the Rhubarb book, is even more Rhubarb-esque in the sense that she was not adopted by such nice people. So she was adopted by people who basically wanted a slave. It's kind of, you read about this occasionally now, that people will take a child in and want it to be their slave. And then when she was 13 years old, the wife took her out of school one lunch and said, "We don't need you anymore, and I'm going to put you on a train for New York City and you're going to get a job." And I mean, 13 is not very old, but so when I have a little audio tape of my mother interviewing her about her life, and she said, "Aunt Charlotte, didn't that upset you?" And she said, "I was just really happy that nobody was going to be beating me anymore." So this was not a good situation. So she went to work at the age of 13, and she had just about every job that an untrained young woman could have at the turn of the century in New York. Her favorite one was she was a hat check girl in the summers on a resort in the Thousand Islands, and this is when people wore a lot of hats. So she made good money at that. But she never had what you'd call a really easy life. So she married this very nice young man, but he was not physically strong. He had a business that was not strong. So she nursed him. He died young. Their children were kind of disasters. The business never quite got off the ground. But she had, through all this, such strength of character and such force of personality that she was always bright and cheerful no matter what. And incidentally, this is not anything to do with her being like Rhubarb, but she had the best death I've ever known. So she was 106 years old. She had all her faculties. And she was at that time living in an old person's home because her daughter, who was very stuffy, didn't think she could live alone anymore. As far as I could tell, she could have lived alone a really long time. And one day at lunch, she said, "I'm not feeling very well. I think I'll go lie down." And she went and lay down and died. And I mean, if you're 106, if you're any age, that's the best way to go. But particularly if you're 106, everybody is just grateful that it worked out that way. So she had this just giant personality. And one day when she was in her 80s, she was walking down the street. She was living in Jersey City, New Jersey. And she saw some young thugs picking on a smaller boy. And she went up to them and said, "Put up your dukes," because I think she'd seen a lot of Mickey Rooney movies. And they were so astonished that this little old feeble lady was standing up to them that they just all went away and left the little boy alone. So I'd like to think that I could be like that at some point in my life. I'm strong, but I'm not that strong. But so Rhubarb pushes all those buttons for me. And besides, I just really find it fun to cook with. So, and then in doing the research for the book, not only did I find out about the history of rhubarb, which, as I said, is really quite interesting, I found out that there's it's a very small chance, that something in rhubarb can combat the holes in the ozone layer. Who knows? It might be true, it might not. There are many. Anyway, it's been used in fiction, it's been used in film. It has many meanings. The word rhubarb means a fight. It's got a lot of baseball connotations. So there's a lot you can do with rhubarb verbally as well as in the kitchen. So for all those reasons, I adore rhubarb. And finally, whoops, let me look at my notes and see if I missed anything. Hang on. Oh, I was going to tell you a little bit how I put the book together. So this is how I put everything together. So there I was with all these recipes, and I just kind of, I don't know if anybody else puts large projects together, but I just do index cards and put them all around a large table, and then I go, what goes with what? And then I try to figure out what essay that I know about rhubarb would go with each section, or if I don't have an essay, then I think, well, what would I like to learn about rhubarb? And then I do that. That's my beginning of my chapter. And it usually works out. The hardest thing was that I did not have my artist anymore. So I had to figure out illustrations. And I have some photographs of food in the book, but I'm not a great food photographer. And there are many rhubarb dishes that I hesitated to say it, but it's true. They look a little blah, because it's kind of this amorphous, sludgy red stuff. So it's between my food photography and the fact that rhubarb isn't always perfectly beautiful to look at. I knew I was not going to fill the book with pictures of food. So as I was brainstorming to myself, saying, self, what can I do? It occurred to me that I should go to the internet. So I went on eBay and I looked for images in the public domain. I would type in rhubarb postcard, 1910, rhubarb this, and I got all these really quite remarkable, fun, like postcards and things that I could buy. They were in the public domain because they were 100 years old, most of them at least, and I could scan them and pop them in the book. So that was not only entertaining, but I think made the book a lot brighter and more fun to look at and to write. And then I learned more stuff. So as I was searching for rhubarb terms, there was a matchbox that said, I think it said SS Rhubarb. And I thought, what is this? Well, it turns out, so this was a matchbook from a hotel in Worcester, and I can't remember the name of the hotel. We could look in the book. But anyway, it had an extremely famous speakeasy during Prohibition days. One of the reasons the speakeasy was famous was that one of the co-owners had a brother in the state police, so it never got raided. And I've seen pictures of it on the internet, the actual speakeasy, and it's just this horrible, dingy, dark cellar, but I guess nobody was going for the atmosphere. So anyway, they were trying to figure out, a password, because at least this is what happens. I've watched a lot of old movies as part of my education. That's how I became Dr. Tinky, watching a lot of old movies. And so, in the movies, they knock on the door and the little thing slides open. They say, who sent you? And you say, Joe sent me, or whatever. So in this particular hotel, when they said, who sent you? You would say, Madame Rhubarb. Because there was a chambermaid at the hotel, and she was from the Czech Republic, or whatever they called it then, Czechoslovakia, and no one could pronounce her last name. So they all called her Madame Rhubarb. So they thought, well, that would make the perfect password. And they apparently still do strange guided tours of the speakeasy even to this day. So apparently, Worcester was this hotbed of alcohol during Prohibition. I guess most cities were hotbeds of alcohol during Prohibition. Anyway, so I learned so much, and I have had a really good time doing this. So what I'm going to do now is just sing you my little rhubarb song, and then we'll talk, if that's okay, about rhubarb. You can ask questions. You can tell me about your own favorite things to do with rhubarb, whatever. So this is my song. The music is not original. When I was a child with my mother so near, she taught me to work with the foods she held dear. And the one she loved best when spring came along was rhubarb. So my mother taught me this song. Cook, cook, cook with the rhubarb. Make pies and muffins and put it in stew. Cook, cook, cook with the rhubarb. The colors of rhubarb will always run true. You can sing along with the chorus next time. Now I have to admit, way down deep in my heart, I found rhubarb old-fashioned and stringy and tart. But my mother kept cooking with the sun up above, and my rhubarb dislike turned to true rhubarb love. Cook, 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 cook with the rhubarb. Make pies and muffins and put it in stew. Cook, cook, cook with the rhubarb. The colors of rhubarb will always run true. Today I'm grown up and my mother's no more, but I treasure the lessons she taught me before. And I know she's still with me in each verdant spring, as I pick my rhubarb and happily sing. Cook, cook, cook with the rhubarb. Make pies and muffins and put it in stew. Cook, cook, cook with the rhubarb. The colors of rhubarb will always run true. Colors of rhubarb, colors of rhubarb. The colors of rhubarb will always run true. Who wants cake? Thank you. I think we should have some cake, and there's more tea.
Okay.
And you can tell me what you guys like to do with rhubarb.
Well, I like rhubarb as rhubarb.
You like it? You like the just plain,
Yeah.
like rhubarb sauce or rhubarb?
Right, right. Many a time, I grew up in Southbridge, but out in what they call the sticks, way out Charlton Street, almost to the Charlton line.
That's also called the rhubarbs, by the way. But go ahead.
Yeah. And we grew all our food. You know, we raised our chickens and we had goats, we had our own milk and so on and so forth. So everything we grew, we canned and so on and so forth. But we had a strawberry patch and a rhubarb patch. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I
you
ever
put them
heard.
together?
Never. We loved the strawberries till they were coming out of our ears, so to speak.
course.
And the same with rhubarb. And even to this day, I look always for somebody that has a rhubarb patch, because I don't have any land anymore. And my father always had a good rhubarb patch, you know. So even today when I visit friends that I haven't seen for a long time, and if I know they have rhubarb, I'm not too ashamed to ask if I can
Well, no,
have
people
some.
actually, first of all, not all of them like rhubarb, but as you
Yeah.
know, that will change
Yeah.
as I go through the world, spreading the world of rhubarb. But also, there's just so much of it sometimes
Yeah.
that people are happy to share.
Well, you know, I even look for it in the market, and the price is out of
It's a
sight,
little hard to.
but it looks half dead, you know. It's,
Well, it doesn't, I don't find that it lasts very long. I'm working on figuring out how to make it last a little longer. I've been told that it's like celery, if you wrap it loosely in aluminum foil, it will last a little bit longer, but I tend to try to use it up pretty quickly, or freeze it, or I make the base for the tea, and then freeze the base for the tea.
Well, many a morning for breakfast, not as the only thing we ate, but it was always toast in a dish of rhubarb sauce. Oh, that was wonderful.
Delicious.
Yeah.
I know, it just makes me happy to think about it. Other rhubarb people? Do you do rhubarb?
We haven't had it that died.
Occasionally it does. I think it's mostly about drainage and fertilizer.
It was
You could try
neglected.
again.
Yeah.
We have it in one spot in our garden and it doesn't spread, it just stays.
Just stays
So,
there,
like
that's
you're saying,
perfect.
Yeah, and it's,
Margaret.
you know, in full sun, so it seems to work.
Yeah, it does like the sun.
Mine comes up twice, really.
Really?
In the spring and the fall?
No, just I cut it early and then.
Oh, then it comes back.
I get two harvests.
Oh, that's
The
perfect.
second harvest is not as plentiful, but
Yeah.
it's still good.
Well, yeah, and it likes being harvested, you know, and I'm sure all of you know this, but just in case some of you are going to have rhubarb and don't know this yet, so when you pick it, you never cut it. You always pull it, yep, and then it somehow likes that, and it kind of stimulates new growth.
Can you just repeat how you just...
So
pull
you
the
grab it and you
Yeah.
pull it kind of horizontally as possible. And most of the time it just pulls out. Sometimes it snaps and then you have to pull the rest. And then of course you chop off the leaf because
That's poisonous.
that's
Yeah.
certainly toxic.
Yeah.
They're kind of, I deal with this in the book a little bit. I'm not sure how many people ever died of eating rhubarb leaves. For one thing, you'd have to eat really a lot of rhubarb leaves, and they don't look very tasty. I've never actually tasted one because I'm not really willing to go that far in my experimentation. But I just I do bring a knife to the garden, and then I chop the leaves off and throw them in there as mulch.
I know it doesn't grow in the south. When my folks moved to the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia, my father brought some.
And it
But,
didn't take.
No.
I have one friend
The
in
soil
northern
has too
Virginia
much
who grows it.
sand
Yeah,
in it.
and also it really does like cooler weather. It doesn't like being hot. What do you like to do with your rhubarb?
Just strawberry rhubarb, that's it.
Yeah.
I make a ton of it. I freeze some of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I put it on ice cream.
It's so pretty.
Yeah. It's so
But there's
good.
nothing as nice as something coming out of your own garden as well.
Absolutely.
I don't grow that
sort
much
of-
stuff, so it's pretty
Yeah.
nice.
Well,
for me.
rhubarb is, if it doesn't die, and yes, it can happen. It has happened to me, because I can kill most anything, but then I get new. It really does, it's not a lot of work. And there it is, and it just makes me so happy when it comes up in the spring, and there it is, its little leaves poking out and going, we're here, we're coming. So it's a special thing. It's not the first thing that I eat out of my yard, which is dandelion greens, but it's after the dandelion greens. Who wants cake? Other thoughts, questions?
But I'd like to ask about the delicious tea that we started out.
Oh, let me tell you about the tea, yes. So what you do to make the tea, I'm just going to put pieces on napkins and you all can come get them. It's really quite simple. So you take your rhubarb and you can cut it relatively coarsely.
No, I'm not going to have any, only because I should be having dessert.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
And then you put it in a pot, and as any of you who cook rhubarb know, it should not be an aluminum pot, stainless steel, enamel, whatever. You want it not reacting with the acid in the rhubarb. And then you pretty much, I think in the book I have exact numbers, but I just kind of almost cover it, or even just cover it barely with water. And then I put it on a very low. Do we have more people needing cake?
No,
No?
just me.
You need it.
I'm just watching them go
Oh,
for me and
you're such a bear. There's plenty of cake, so.
dying on one side.
And like this piece.
Well, this
Do
has
people
to
need
be-
more tea?
This has to be one of the real reasons why people should attend the programs as opposed to looking at it.
Well, yeah,
online.
they can't taste anything if they're looking at the
No,
video.
unfortunately.
Sorry, guys. Anyway,
Yeah.
so you cover it with the
I'll have
water.
some tea. I
Oh,
love
you want some more tea?
Yeah.
Well, you didn't get tea. You came late.
Too.
Yes. So then
Thank you.
I think I say how long in the book, but basically you just turn it on very low.
One tea.
They're all small.
That's great.
See, because it's only half a cake.
That's good.
And just cook it till it softens and releases most of its color to the water. And then I just leave it for a minute or two. Then I strain it through cheesecloth. Usually, as some of you may know, if you have the rhubarb pulp, you can, if you have something like a copper pan, you can rest your copper pan in the rhubarb pulp overnight, and it is miraculously polished for you because the acid just is amazing. And then you put just a pinch of salt in the rhubarb juice. Then if you were a shaker, what the shakers do, which is not what I have in my book because I had to do what my neighbor did because she told me that I had to do it that way. The shakers would then add, while the juice was still warm, would add some sugar to taste, just till it takes the edge off the rhubarb. And then the zest and juice of one orange, or lemon, but I like orange better. And that would be, they called it rhubarb tea, but it was basically rhubarb infusion. So that had no caffeine. What I do is I take the juice that I have, and I do 1 part juice, 1 part of a very light sugar syrup that I make, and then 2 parts tea. And what I've done lately, which is what I did for you today, is I use half black tea and half like Constant Comment, so it gets that Constant's got the cinnamon and the cloves and all those good flavors that go really nicely with rhubarb. Alternately, you could just put a cinnamon stick and a couple cloves in your rhubarb juice and just use plain tea. It's whatever you like, but I think that gives it that a little bit of extra zing. So, and it's pretty easy to do. I make it a lot. And this is just a plain pound cake. So butter, sugar, flour, baking powder, farm fresh eggs. And then you chop up your rhubarb. I don't know whether this one has, sometimes I forget it and I don't see it. So this may not, did anybody taste orange?
I did.
Yeah, okay, then there's a little orange zest. And then I just toss my...
But I had 2 pieces though. So
Oh, well, so maybe, well, who knows? Anyway, there should be enough orange zest to taste. But then I just toss the small pieces of rhubarb in a little bit of confectioner's sugar so that they don't all sink to the bottom of the pan when I bake. And that just gives them just a little tiny bit more sugar. And if I had been doing this at home, I would have sprinkled confectioner's sugar on the top to make it pretty. But since I brought it all wrapped up, I thought you all could do without that.
So I just had a question about your connection to music.
Okay.
Because I would hate if that got lost, because I know our focus tonight is on the book, but I know that you have a background, and I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, so music is, gosh, when I was talking about how lucky I am to write about food, I think music is a similar occupation. And I'm only a part-time musician, but I think music, I went to a forum the other day in which people were having a lot of political strife. And the leader led us through this exercise where we all it was basically a meditation thing. So you were, relaxing your entire body, and then you were thinking positive thoughts about yourself, and then you were thinking about somebody you love, and then you were thinking them about somebody you hate. So you were wishing that everybody in the world basically was happy and healthy and calm. And I thought that is, to me, kind of what music does. If you're in a room full of people singing, which we're not in as many times as we used to be in this culture, but I think it's still an important thing. To me, that you get that feeling of coming together, every voice is different, but they somehow blend together. So I never have been, I did a little bit of musical training when I was in college, and then I lost my voice because I was very nervous at that time. I know, hard to believe, but I was very shy. And so somehow studying music and trying to train my voice made it just kind of go away, and it went away for several years. And then, I don't know what happened, but somebody asked me to sing somewhere, and I thought, it's not Carnegie Hall. And I love to sing. I grew up in a community where we had regular dinner parties where they always ended with people singing. The whole room singing folk songs or Broadway shows, tunes, or old, my grandmother used to sing her old songs from about 1910 that she loved. So at this point, I do a few concerts a year, and I love doing it, and I love the connection with the audience. And my favorite thing is to have singing along at the end, because it as I said, there's something about the energy in a room where everybody's singing that is so special to me. So I'm not a great singer, as you could probably tell, but I have a lot of personality, and I have a lot of fun, and the audience usually has fun too. So.
I thought you had a beautiful voice.
Well, thank you. Not as pretty as my grandmother. It loses something in every generation. God knows what will happen in another generation or two, but that's all right. We all have a really wonderful time. She was called the little girl with the big voice. So, and they almost trained her for opera, but then, as I said, she got adopted. But it all worked out for her in the end. Other thoughts, questions? We have more tea, we have more cake.
Well, it's a very convivial setting, and thank you for providing the food and the
Oh, it's my
hydration.
pleasure.
very nice.
I think, when you share food, you share your life.
When you go to sing someplace, where is it that you go?
Usually near where I am. So I have a concert coming up next month in Charlemont.
So you live in Hawley?
I live in Hawley, which is like
Yeah, very near Charlemont.
near Charlemont.
Yeah.
So I'm doing a concert on August 25th, which is Leonard Bernstein's 100th birthday, or would have been had he lived.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing songs and people who came into the world in 1918. So there'll be several Bernstein songs, but he can be a little sophisticated. I have a lot of like little old ladies whom I adore, who are some of my core constituencies. So I can't sing all Leonard Bernstein. But then there are all these other people. Robert Preston, whom you'll know from The Music Man and other things. Pearl Bailey.
Yeah.
My mother was born in 1918, and even though she lost her voice and never came back, so she would always croak through life. She sang all the time, even if she couldn't sing. I don't think that should stop anybody. So I'm going to have a really good time. I'm having fun putting the program together.
Very enjoyable.
Yeah, except my dog doesn't like anything that's at all high, and she's gotten to this point when I'm rehearsing. I made a tape of the accompaniment to most of the songs, and the highest song, when the introduction comes on the tape, before I open my mouth, my dog goes, oh! She just hates it. But the girl's got to practice her high notes, so we're both going, oh! Together by the end of the song. It's pretty silly, but I keep hoping one of these days she'll give up.
So what about like your background? Do you like to do any kind of ethnic food? Is there anything in your sort of legacy that you bring from your heritage or whatever?
Oh, so
Because a
I
lot of
do.
people-
Well, certainly. I mean, I do holidays. So and because I'm half Christian and half Jewish, so we do Christmas and we do Hanukkah and we do Easter and we do Passover. So I do those things. And if anybody introduces me to any ethnic food, I'm always excited and thrilled. And I do love a good curry because I lived in India when I was a little girl. So there are things I go to. Mostly I'm kind of a plain cook, and I think of myself more as a writer than every once in a while I'm introduced as a chef, and I'm really not a chef. But in a way, I think that makes my writing more accessible, because sometimes when you see what a chef does and you think, I'm never going to do that. And then you see what I do and you think, any fool could do that. So I do think that helps. I have a neighbor of mine who's 92 years old, who's a composer, and who actually for many years was my accompanist when I performed. And she does wonderful song leading sessions. And so she will have students come, she's having some come next week, and they come and they study actually how to lead songs in their churches or their communities or their synagogues or whatever. And what she wants to teach them not to do is, so they all have beautiful voices, and they'll go now, and so when you're teaching a song, you line it out. You say, here's the first line, la 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 la, and they'll go la 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 la. And everybody in the audience kind of freezes because they're not going to sing like that. But Alice, my neighbor, has this very little tiny, very precise, but very small voice. And I think it really encourages people to sing, to have that, if she can sing it, I can sing it. So that's kind of the way my cooking is.
Interesting.
Doesn't mean I don't take it seriously, but I like to be simple, and as you all probably know, if you have really good ingredients, and we are so lucky to live in a corner of the world where at least at this time of year we have wonderful fresh food, then you don't really need to get too elaborate in your cooking. So I think we are fortunate that way.
So you take advantage of the fact that you live in Hawley. Is that part of the Connecticut Valley, so that your food comes a little earlier than ours?
Well, except,
I know it does in
no, I have to go down. I live it's up on a hill.
Yeah.
So our food probably comes a little later than yours, but I can go downhill and go to the valley and get wonderful food. That's what I tend to do that from time to time. Even I'm part of, I own a farm share and I love it, but
Yeah,
they're not going to have tomatoes for a month. So
yeah.
I go other places and buy my tomatoes and my corn right now because I can't live without them. They're too good. If they're fresh, they're so good.
Is the share with Atlas?
No, this is even closer to me. It's a little tiny farm in Charlemont. I love Atlas. I go there and shop.
That's great, yeah.
But this is it's called Wilderbrook Farm, and the people who run it are, I guess they're hippies, or they were at
Yeah.
one time, and they just love doing it. The farm shares are very reasonable. The thing I particularly like about it is that you go and you they say you can have whatever you want up to this.
Oh, really?
So if they are offering me 5 heads of lettuce in a week, and I know I'm not having company, even though I'm a girl who eats salad every day, I don't take the whole 5 heads. I let somebody else have more heads. So you can take what you need, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And also, my other favorite thing is because as I am such a bad gardener, the woman who's the wife of the pair is a wonderful flower gardener, and she has these gorgeous flowers, and we get flowers every week, and it just makes my house beautiful and makes my cat happy trying to destroy the bouquets. So she goes, she never quite succeeds.
So you said you lived in India as a kid, and I know you were down in Texas for a while. Have living in multiple places influenced your cooking style at all?
I think so. I mean, certainly living in Texas did. I do a fair amount of Southwestern cooking. I do some Indian cooking. I was too little when we lived in the Philippines. We lived in the Philippines when I was a little girl. And the best thing that has given me is now all these Facebook friends, because this is totally irrelevant, but I just have to share this piece of information for you. For years, I was hoping that someone I knew would name their child Tinky, because I think it's such an adorable name.
What was that name?
Tinky, that's
Tinky?
my name, like Tinkerbell.
Oh, like
And no one, nieces, nephews, cousins, brother, no one wanted to name their child Tinky. Then on Facebook, I reconnected with my 4th grade teacher in the Philippines. She named her daughter Tinky. I guess I was a really good student. Anyway, it just makes me very happy. And she's always saying, "Oh, Tinky, I'm so proud of you." So that's very sweet.
It's lovely. Well, thank you for an amazing evening.
My pleasure.
It's just such bounty. It was so interesting to hear you talk, and also thank you for all the goodies that you brought
Oh, my
us and
pleasure.
shared
There's
with
more
us
if
this
anybody
evening.
needs a little refill before we break up. And should anyone wish to buy a book, I will sell them, but I'm not pushing them on you.
Thank you. The library will have copies, so if anybody is interested, and we've also had a call, that's what,
Oh.
yeah, so we have somebody who's interested. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Tinky Weisblat. Thank you for coming here, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to have you back.
Well,
later
my
time.
next book is about funeral food,
Ah,
which is a passion of mine. There are a lot of old people in Holly, so there are a lot of funerals. So it made me very interested in what people do, and I'm trying to get at least one recipe from each state in the United States. And they do seem quite diverse.
so that'll be an interesting.
Yeah, so speaking of ethnic cooking, it's not exactly ethnic, but regional cooking.
Yeah, that'll be
It
fun.
differs quite a lot, so it's fun. Some people think it's depressing, but I find funerals enlightening. Yes, they're sad, but you learn so much about people.
Well, we look forward to that book, and
Okay.
we hope that you might come here and present as well
I'd be
again.
happy to.
Thank you very
You've all
much.
been very good. Thank you. Thank you. So more tea, more cake? A little more cake? I mean, we've got it.